Our scripture today comes from Joshua chapter 14, verses 6 through 14. The people of Judah came to Joshua at Gilgal. Caleb, son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, spoke. You remember what God said to Moses, the man of God, concerning you and me back at Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of God, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land. And I brought back an honest and accurate report. My companions who went with me discouraged the people, but I stuck to my guns totally with God, my God. That was the day that Moses solemnly promised the land on which your feet have walked will be your inheritance, you and your children's forever. Yes, you have lived totally for God. Now look at me. God has kept me alive as he has promised. It is now 45 years since God spoke this word to Moses, years in which Israel wandered in the wilderness. And here I am today, 85 years old, and I'm as strong as I was on the day that Moses sent me out. I'm as strong as ever in battle, whether coming or going. So give me this hill country that God promised me. You yourself heard the report that the Anakim were there with their great fortress cities. If God goes with me, I will drive them out, just as God has said. So Joshua blessed him, and he gave Hebron to Caleb, son of Jephunneh, as an inheritance. Hebron belongs to Caleb, son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite, still today, because he gave himself totally to God, the God of Israel. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be unto God. As I get older, I seem to like and certainly understand better jokes about getting older. And so I wanted to share with you some things that I had read during this past week I thought were kind of funny. One was, at my age, I don't want to eat health food. I need all the preservatives I can get. Another one is, life is like a roll of toilet paper. The closer it gets to the end, the faster it goes. One I thought was kind of nice is, isn't it nice that wrinkles don't hurt? Because, boy, everything else does. Here's one maybe particularly for me and some of the other men in the congregation. I knew I was getting bald because it was taking longer and longer to wash my face. And then maybe some of you can resonate with this one. I finally got my head together only to find that now my body is falling apart. And then my favorite one is, when you get old, your secrets are safe with your friends because they'll never share them. They can't remember them, and you can't either. Sometimes as we get older, we can concentrate maybe too much on what our limitations are. We should certainly know our limitations, maybe thinking I don't recover as quickly as I used to, or I can't eat like I used to and still stay in any sort of decent shape, and so on. So we should know our limitations, but we can't concentrate completely on them. If we do, we'll find that our lives will be consumed by can'ts, and all of our life will be one big can't. And while it is true there are some things we are limited on, it is also true that we're probably not nearly as limited as we think, and certainly not as limited as we will think we are if all we concentrate on are the things that we cannot do. While giving a wary but not completely agreeing nod to the cannots, we should focus instead on the cans, on what we can do. And we can see this in today's scripture. It's about Caleb. Caleb was Joshua's steadfast friend and fellow Israelite. Caleb came from the tribe of Judah, we learn, but we see here he's also called a Kenizzite. The Kenizzites were a people from Canaan. They were part of the Edomite tribe, part of those folks that are always a thorn in the side to Israel. And so perhaps part of Caleb's family came from the Kenizzite people and were adopted into the people of Israel. But at any rate, there's some sort of mixing there. And this would have made Caleb something of an outlier as a person who would not be fully and completely accepted in Israel. They would never let him forget that he was also a Kenizzite or from Kenizzite background. We can see this sometimes today. I'll tell you about one place I used to live where just about everybody there was born there, and their families had been there for generations. And a man right next to the school passed away. And I'll tell you honestly, the paper said, while Mr. Johnson is not a native of the county, he moved here with his family when he was 3 months old. Mr. Johnson was like in his 90s when he passed away. So even though he had lived there 90-some years, they never let him forget that he was not from there. And that's the way it must have been with Caleb too. But Caleb did not let this hinder him. He took full part in the life of Israel and was among the most faithful believers in the God of Israel. If you remember, when the Hebrews reached the borders of the Promised Land, Moses sent spies into the land to spy it out and to come back with reports. And when the spies came back, all but 2 of them gave very disturbing reports about giant people and fortified cities, and were very discouraged, saying that, the Hebrews could not possibly conquer the land of Canaan. 2 of the spies, however, while recognizing that there were giants and fortified cities, concentrated instead on the goodness of the land and on God's promise to be with them. These 2 faithful and positive spies who said Israel could take the land were Joshua, who became the leader of the people after Moses, and Caleb, who we've just been talking about. But because of the people's unfaithfulness, they had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. After that 40 years of wandering, with most of that faithless generation having passed away, the people then entered the land under the leadership of Joshua. And among the faithful remnant who came along with the new generation was Caleb, who now apparently was about 80 years old. Yet his age didn't stop him from campaigning right alongside the others, helping them to conquer the lands it would be giving to them, to other families and to other tribes, helping each other out. It wasn't his land, mind you, but he was helping others to take theirs. And when at the end of the campaign it came time to parcel out land after 5 years of conquest, Caleb came to Joshua, and he had kind of a strange request. Now at 85, having been faithful to God and God's people his whole life, throughout the Exodus, throughout the time in the wilderness, throughout the war in the Promised Land, Caleb might be expected at this point to maybe take it easy. And, he would probably be given anything that he asked for. He could have asked for nice, rich farmland, fat with orchards and crops and cattle, and it would be given to him gladly. But instead, what does Caleb ask for? After reminding Joshua of his faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to him, he asks not for the rich land with orchards and so forth, but he asks Joshua for the hill country that is occupied by the Anakim. These are gigantic people who live in fortified cities. And in essence, what Caleb is saying, let me have the very land that is full of the things that frightened those people 45 years ago. And he goes on declaring his faith in God, who has been so faithful to him, and says that though he is 85 years old, he is as tough and able as he was 45 years ago. Notice that he does not concentrate on the cannots, but on what he can. He doesn't focus on difficulties, even though he acknowledges them, but instead focuses on God's promises and God's faithfulness. Joshua grants his old friend his request. And we read that Caleb and his family, with faith in God, moving to action, took the land that was given to them. They defeated the gigantic people that everyone was afraid of, and took the fortified cities that everyone else was certain couldn't be taken. And so we see here that action taken in accordance with God's promise, with faith in God, moves mountains. It changes cannots into can-dos. It changes the future. It's able to defeat giants and overcome obstacles, and it makes our purposes possible. Sometimes God says, stand back and see what I'm going to do for you. You won't have to do a thing. But most of the time, what God tells us is he will go with us as we go. And so he did with the Israelites. God promised the Israelites that wherever their feet should tread, the land would be theirs. All they had to go do was go in and keep on walking, and God would give it to them. Notice he didn't fly them in on a magic carpet. They had to do the walking. They had to go and fight, but God promised to be with them and to give them all he promised. And he did. Sometimes they would go and they would have to march, and sometimes they would go and they would blow horns and the battle would be won, but at other times they had to actually fight. But the victory was God's to give, and as they went with him, he allowed them to win and turn can't do's into can do's. The Israelites, though, never fully took the land that God gave them. After they had taken a significant portion of it, they got kind of tired and they just sat down. They had gotten their own land and enough of it, so they sat down. They quit walking. But that isn't Caleb's fault, because he kept on walking, and God gave him and his family a blessing for doing so. So remembering Caleb as an example of active faith in God, let us keep on walking and not leave any land that God would give us untrod, because we might get tired and sit down or lose faith and fall over. Let's keep going. My father used to, when he was young, play football in his high school, and he and another boy went to watch another team who were really, really good. And that team had just crushed their opposition completely, and it was toward the end of the game. And the running back got the football, and he ran all the way down to the goal line, and then before he crossed over, he just sat down. They'd already had the score run up so high they couldn't lose, and he was trying not to run it up anymore. But when he sat down at the goal line, he just got creamed. All the other players from the other team just ran right over top of him. And my dad said you could hear the coach yelling at him when he got to the sideline saying, "Why did you stop?" And said the fellow just smiled and said, "Coach, I just got tired." Well, sometimes we're the same way. We get so close to the goal line, but we get tired and we sit down. It's true we need rest sometimes, so let's rest when we need rest. But as long as we have breath, let's not let our rest become permanent. Let's keep on walking, and God will keep on walking with us.